So this interview is with Dr. Ronan Hatfull, who was just great to get to talk to because he's such an expert on Shakespeare and Shakespeare adaptations, both like with experience on the academic side of things and like writing articles, writing a book about Shakespeare and adaptation practice, and also from the creative practical side of like his acting and music work and stuff like that. So I think it's such an interesting combination of skills, and to have about like 12 different job titles all relating to Shakespeare and adaptations and performing, like it felt like a privilege to be able to talk to someone who has such a wide range of experience and knowledge to such a high level about Shakespeare and all of the different adaptation things that go on. So I had a great time and I learnt a lot, and there's also a bonus tip about how to help you access difficult Shakespeare texts at the end, so make sure you stay tuned as well. And here's the interview. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about, which I think would be good to get in your own words, is you do quite a lot of different things. You've researched and like have expertise in a lot of different areas. So who are you and what do you do?
My name is Ronan Hatfull. I'm a teaching fellow at the University of Warwick, specialise in Shakespeare and performance and adaptation studies. I also work as a lecturer at NYU London, teaching students that are over from New York University doing a semester in London studying Shakespeare and the kind of Elizabethan and Jacobean stage. So very much all about contemporary approaches to Shakespeare, how Shakespeare's been like reconceptualized, rethought, reconsidered in the 20th century and the 21st century, but mainly like the back half of the 20th century to like now. And I'm always trying to kind of teach and think about what is being done to and with Shakespeare like right now. I do have historical interests as well, but it really is all for me about like live theatre. I'm a musician and an actor, so I have a lot of background in performing myself. And I've been working at Warwick in the theatre and performance studies department since 2020. I've been here a good number of years now. I also did my PhD at Warwick as well, about the Reduced Shakespeare Company, which I'm sure we'll get into in a bit.
Yes, and I think what's interesting about the Reduced Shakespeare Company and all of these modern adaptations is they try to make text that was written so many years ago more accessible, because I think a lot of people feel the barrier to entry for that. So I was wondering, like, you've studied Shakespeare to a high level, you're like high level Shakespeare expert. So like what was your personal relationship with Shakespeare getting into that, and did you feel a barrier when you were first approaching Shakespeare?
Um, yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a question I ask, like, talk to my students a lot about because I teach a first year module on Hamlet. That a lot of the time we are talking about. These are obviously students that have come to uni to study English literature and theatre studies, but you would be surprised how many of them say that they didn't necessarily engage with Shakespeare as much as you'd like to at school. I'm a bad person to ask this question to because I've always felt quite well connected to Shakespeare, but there are reasons for that. I think those reasons are really all to do with like I've already mentioned this when I introduced myself, but in the liveness of Shakespeare. So like I have a vague memory of I'm not one of those kids that can like remember absolutely every detail of their adolescence like
Yeah.
like some people have like total recall, but I do have a memory of like my mum taking me to see A Midsummer Night's Dream like outdoors at my primary school, and I also from like I think 7 or 8 years old was doing like drama like outside of school to like I was doing like it wasn't just like going and doing like games and stuff. I was doing like drama exams, so like having to like perform speeches and do scenes. And we definitely, I don't know how old, again, I don't know how old I was, but like under 10, we did a bit, we didn't do all of it, but we did like, like the Rude Mechanicals bit at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream when they put on the play and I played Peter Quince. and I had to do a big speech. And I was very lucky, like that I had great English lit teachers at secondary school who were very inspirational and got us to think about it. And my mum is a linguist and like studied modern languages, but also loves Shakespeare and has like taken me to the theatre a lot. So I think I was lucky that again, it's the thing of like which I always preach to people that if you can see it live and if you can, not everyone wants to be an actor. I love acting, I love performing. Not everyone like wants. My mum's also an act like has worked as an
Yeah.
actor as well, so we have that connection. So there's a family thing there, but also like yeah, just seeing it and doing it was big for me.
Yeah, I think like often people get scared from it on a page, don't they? Whereas really like
Mm.
once it's live, it's a bit easier. And like there was conversation as well about common modern adaptation tropes, like setting it somewhere else or re-editing texts, or like the reduced Shakespeare Company cover the plot but not, and like include elements of the text but not fully, and like using elements of the verse in different new modern ways. So what kind of modern adaptation tropes do you think about, and what are your thoughts on them?
Like in terms of like tropes like right now that are
Yeah,
happening.
like what is there and what do you
Mm.
think of them?
I think of one of the big things at the moment, and actually he got mentioned, the director Jamie Lloyd got mentioned on stage by FA, the female member of the Reduced Shakespeare Company in this show. Um, I think there's a real drive towards, I think, getting his work, and whether or not this is an aesthetic, I don't really know, but towards like celebrity casting. I think like famous actors have always done Shakespeare, like it's not a new thing. Um, it's, I think to think of it as a new thing is to forget that like most actors, if they've gone through drama school or they've done some training or have done acting at school, may have done Shakespeare, are likely to have done Shakespeare at some point. So it's just in like the lifeblood of actors. But I do think that like in his work, Jamie Lloyd specifically, when he like cast Tom Holland to play Romeo or Sigourney Weaver to play like Prospero in The Tempest, or like Tom Hiddleston and Hayley Atwell as Benedict and Beatrice, like he's casting people who are like known for like all four of them, for instance, like in various like the Marvel movies or like superhero movies or science fiction. I think so. I think there's that. I think there's also like an attempt, and I don't know where this attempt's going, but to try and make Shakespeare on stage. I'm obviously talking about like the actual plays here in performance, not adaptations, but plays where they still use the original language, but like to make it really naturalistic, um, to kind of go away from the kind of the old school, like delivering it
Mm.
like it's like shouting it,
Yeah.
um, which it hasn't been like for quite a long time, but like for me, like the pinnacle of that acting style of like naturalism in Shakespeare is somebody like Andrew Scott playing Hamlet, or like David Tennant playing Hamlet. Those kinds of actors in those kinds of roles. But I think there's an element, and some of this is like, lots of this is, I think, influenced by TV and film and that kind of acting style, where like we all like have the subtitles on when we watch TV now. Um, Partly because actors will talk I'll come in like close to the camera, but like very, very quietly and will mumble like what they're saying. And like I really love Shakespeare being delivered as though it's just being made up on the spot, and that it doesn't sound like pompous old
Yeah.
um old language, but I think also like it is meant to be performed. Um, and so I've seen some productions, I think, increasingly where the attempt to make it relatable and identifiable and naturalistic is so like extreme that to some extent you lose like the fact that it is performance poetry, and you still need, and also like actors still have to like live still have to project to the back of the theater. Um, and like yeah, the show that the Reduced Shakespeare Company show, the complete works of William Shakespeare abridged, I think they managed to strike that balance quite well, in that you could hear everything they were saying, but they still felt like they were performing in a naturalistic way.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well to see the reduced Shakespeare Company take on all of the plays, which is obviously the point of it. But what really stood out to me was when they said that like sometimes the tragedies are funnier than the comedies. So what do you think about like the different sections, like tragedy, comedy, history? Like, do you think there's anything in them that like people don't really expect?
Yeah, I think part of that, that's something I wrote about in my book. Um, that I think because they are a comedy, because they're a comedy company and they are a parody, like what they've written and created is a parody.
Yeah,
Um, they, it's hard to parody something that's already a parody. Do you know? Or like, or that is like Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance, which I've already mentioned, already has a kind of parody in it in the rude mechanicals when they put on the play
yeah,
within the play, which not only kind of like parodies just the whole convention of putting on theatre, which is a funny, silly thing to do anyway. And the fact that like Bottom and Peter Quince in that play are like, this all matters so much. Which is what putting on a play feels like, but it doesn't really matter at all in the grand scheme of things. Like, you know, when like there's a war going on in Iran or something like that, it's like it doesn't really matter, but it also does. Um, and I guess my point is that like some of Shakespeare's comedies are already, like most of them are already incredibly ridiculous and silly and have, you know, over the top cases of mistaken identity and cross-dressing and these things that are already quite funny and quite parodic. So I think where the Reduced Shakespeare Company like draw lots of their energy from is like making something appear different to what you expect it to be.
yeah,
Um, and I mean, I do also genuinely think some of Shakespeare's tragedies are actually like are quite funny, or there are at least moments in them that are
yeah,
quite funny. I teach Macbeth a lot at Warwick, and I think Macbeth's a really good example of an incredibly dark play that is benefited by recognizing that there are moments of humor amongst the horror. Like, I mean, for me, like I was had a meeting with a student earlier today and we were talking about the taming of the shrew and the fact the idea that like the balance between comedy and horror in like you know think about like the greatest horror movies I can think of like recent times like Get Out for instance is really funny and really scary, often at the same time. And the whole idea of being in a theater or a cinema and like screaming and or laughing, even though they're like different
yeah,
emotional responses, they're also like physically not that dissimilar. So I think what they're trying to say often is that maybe like people going to see Shakespeare plays, especially the tragedies where you go and you expect it to be like a reverent spiritual experience that actually like bits of Hamlet. I mean, obviously we can get onto that maybe later, but the fact that so much of the complete works show the entire second half is about Hamlet,
yeah,
they dedicate that time to that play because again, Hamlet is I'm not saying Hamlet's funny the whole time, it definitely isn't. But like the whole idea of the central character of that play, Hamlet himself, is somebody in like the genre of play is revenge tragedy, and he is terrible at taking revenge or like taking action. Like he's
mm,
always like being like, what should I do? Why should I do this? How should I do it? He isn't like he's the opposite of like Macbeth, who
yeah,
like acts like you know he needs his you know his wife helps him out and encourages him but like Hamlet is like somebody who's bad at the thing that he is meant to be doing in his play and that's kind of I'm not saying that's necessarily like funny but it can be you can easily like paint that as being slightly ridiculous and that's what they do as a company and they're never like I don't think they're criticizing Shakespeare. I think that it comes from a real, I mean, I know this having interviewed the company members and founders, like it comes from a real place of love and affection for the source material, but it also comes from a place of where like just because you love something, just because you love Shakespeare, doesn't mean you can't take the Mickey out of it. That's like a sign of love and affection for something. Do you know what I mean?
yeah. What do you think of the histories as well? Because I'm looking at them now,
Oh
and
yeah,
Richard the Second, I can't take him seriously.
really.
I'm meant to.
Yeah, no, no. The history plays in general are plays that it took me. I didn't study any of the history plays until I was in third year. I also did my undergraduate at Warwick. So I was taught those plays, and I remember coming to them and being like, "Why are we studying the history plays? What's the point? Like, we've got all these other options. Why would we study these plays like Henry the Sixth, Part One, Two, or Three, when we could do Macbeth or King Lear or Hamlet?"
Yeah,
And I don't know if you're just asking me like how do I feel about the history plays, like maybe a bit in general. I've really come around to loving some of them. Um, I do a module at Warwick for second and third years that the first term we took like a history of adaptation from early 20th century to now, and we do it with one play. And I do it with Henry IV, Part One, because lots of the students have never studied that play before, and it gives them something a little bit different. And that's become one of my absolute favorite plays. I know what you mean about Richard II, because he's so over the top. I don't know. Did you see Jonathan Bailey play play the part?
No,
He
I've
did
not
it.
read it.
He did it last year, and he played it at the Bridge Theatre in London last year, and he is a ridiculous figure. Yeah, I agree
Yeah.
with you.
And these plays have changed in popularity over time because, like, we talk about Hamlet, Macbeth, and like all of
Mm.
that. But I think Cymbeline, I read that was popular in the 18th century, and like Titus Andronicus was very popular at the time.
Mm.
So, what do you think about the changing popularity of that? Like, do you feel like the adaptations and the way we've approached it has really changed?
The approach to adapting Shakespeare definitely has changed. Yeah, for sure. I know that like in the Victorian era, uh, they were far less willing to like entertain, I think, like as radical adaptations as we in the modern era. And that's obvious. Sounds like it's an obvious thing to say, as we are as a society. But also they were. I think there's historically been an approach, certainly to a play like King Lear, which for me like has probably the most bleak ending of any Shakespeare play. That there was an adaptation by somebody called Nahum Tate, where he rewrote the play to have a happy ending, which is hilarious. I'd love to see that version of the play, but like Cordelia doesn't die, gets married to Edgar, and like they all live happily ever after.
Wasn't that like the main version for ages?
You're right. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Wow.
Um, which is wild. Because like, I mean, part of that play's appeal is the like, it's there's a to go back to like the Greeks, there's a catharsis to seeing the play end the way it ends. And unlike Shakespeare's other tragedies, I would argue like there's a tiny bit of hope in Hamlet. There's a tiny bit of hope in Macbeth. There's a little bit of hope in Othello, based purely on the fact that they actually do. I mean, maybe just on the fact that they actually do catch Iago, um, and maybe
But
like
they're
the
all dead.
no,
Most.
I know, everyone that matters is dead. Yeah, yeah. But I think Lear is incredibly bleak. But no, that question you ask about plays that have come in and out of fashion is really, really interesting. Titus Andronicus is definitely one that has come back into fashion, I think, more recently. Well, it gets staged quite a lot now, and I think that's maybe because I mean, yeah, Shakespeare's society, they were watching public hangings, and bear baiting like
Mm.
was happening right next to where Shakespeare's plays were being put on. So they clearly had, and they clearly had a pretty intimate relationship with death and violence like as a spectacle. And you could argue that, fortunately we don't in the UK have public hangings or bear baiting, but that we are exposed to like violence and death like on the news like all the time. Horror movies and video games are like, this again, I'm not saying anything that hasn't been the case for quite a while, but I like, there's lots of violent content out there that people, quite worryingly can access very easily if they want to. And so Titus Andronicus, which is like Shakespeare's most violent play, like in terms, and also I like this is something I looked at a little bit early on in my PhD before I kind of really got into looking at the reduced Shakespeare Company, but like the aestheticization of violence. So like stuff like Quentin Tarantino as a director would do, where like he's exploring violence as like beautiful or as like an aesthetic act. That's kind of what Titus Andronicus is doing a bit as well. So maybe that's why that play has had a revival. And like Measure for Measure, which is not a play I love that much, but that's been staged a lot more, I think, recently because of it being about somebody that tries to coerce somebody into sleeping with them and is an abuser and a misogynist, and that obviously means that play is incredibly relevant within like the context of the Me Too movement.
But that
Um,
feels sort of similar to like Two Gentlemen of Verona is a bit toxic, is it not?
Mm. Yeah, 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 yeah. I would say so. Yeah, 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 yeah. So yeah, there are certainly plays that I think come in and out of fashion. Um, Macbeth, I think, like Macbeth, as far as I'm aware, Macbeth seems to be the play that gets taught the most at secondary schools. I don't necessarily know if that's always been the case. So that's interesting as well. Why that maybe I don't know why is that play so that play's obviously never been not popular,
Yeah.
but why is that play taught to like kids a lot as well? It's quite interesting.
Do you think there are any plays that you feel are underrated?
Henry the Fourth, Part One, um, for sure. I don't think it's underrated by like Shakespeare people.
Yeah, they love
Um,
it.
but I think it's underrated in terms of like it should be beyond like people that like research, study, act, perform Shakespeare. I think it should be recognized as one of his like most beloved works because it's got everything. It's funny, it's sad, it's got like it's got a love story, it's got an amazing central character, it's got like a really great fool character, it's got like the kind of like dysfunctional dad and son dynamic that you also get obviously in Hamlet. And you've got some battles. So I think that's a great question. I think Cymbeline to some extent. I went through a phase of loving Cymbeline. And I think Cymbeline's like a mess as a play, but like it's kind of a gorgeous mess. Like it's a beautiful mess of a play. Um, are there any others?
There's a bit of
Um,
desensitization to violence in Cymbeline, isn't there? Because he just gets
yeah.
murdered when randomly.
The bit where he gets his head, where is it, Clot gets his head chopped off or
Yeah.
something? Yeah, exactly. He's just gone. I think Shakespeare was on one when he was writing that play. I don't think he was really like thinking hugely about what he was doing. I probably shouldn't say that as a Shakespeare scholar. Um, but I don't think it's got like I mean lots of his later plays I think are a bit like that where he seems to just be experiment. Like The Winter's Tale is a bit like that as well, where there's like there's sometimes doesn't feel like there's a huge like consistency of vision. He's just he's just going on vibes and seeing kind of what happens from scene to scene. But I don't think there's any others like any comedies I think are underrated. Um, I think for me like sometimes when I see a really good production of a Shakespeare play, especially one that I've never been like hugely like oh that's an amazing play like Troilus and Cressida. I saw that at the Globe last year and it was phenomenal and that made me think that's a great play like there's so much to love in that play in terms of like the and I think also because there are so many really well the Shakespeare plays that are like have a big reputation and are performed all the time like Romeo and Juliet for instance. I love Romeo and Juliet but like Troilus and Cressida kind of has a it's central the central characters have a kind of Romeo and Juliet type relationship but because it doesn't have the kind of the reputation that comes with Romeo and Juliet and the fact that anyone that loves Shakespeare will know the balcony scene and like know some of the lines. Sometimes I think that gets in the way and going to experience a Shakespeare play and not knowing what's going to happen is quite difficult, especially if you do what I do, where I've seen lots of these plays a lot, many, many times. So you have to kind of suspend your disbelief a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are Julius Caesar. I think is a little bit underrated. I don't think it's like one that people are like it's not good, but I think oddly a little bit underrated. I really love Julius Caesar.
Interesting. And you speak about Henry the Fourth Part One. There's a few of these plays that have multiple parts. So how do you think people approach adapting them? Because I guess you can put them all into one play like the reduced Shakespeare Company do, but that's not what everyone will do.
Yeah. Well, with that one particularly, that's an interesting case because Henry the Fourth Part One is a lot more beloved than Henry the Fourth Part Two, and also like Part One works as I would argue Part One works really well as its own standalone narrative in like the trajectory of Prince Hal, um, from the start to the end of the play, where he kind of redeems himself and he kills Hotspur like his rival. And sure, there is like ambiguity and like a bit of like to be continued at the end,
Mhm.
um, with King Henry but you can see that as being like a fulfilled story arc for one character. But I mean, Robert Icke, did his thing called Player Kings, his production called Player Kings with Ian McKellen playing Falstaff. Um, is that about 2 years ago? And he did do it like you're saying. I mean, it wasn't a reduced production at all. He just took the kind of epic approach where the first half was Henry the Fourth Part One, and the second half was Henry the Fourth Part Two. So it was really long. I mean, it was an amazing production, and seeing Ian McKellen on stage play like one of the greatest Shakespeare parts in Falstaff was like a total privilege. But he took that approach of where he was like, I'm just going to do like an epic. I think it was probably nearly 4 hours total, including an interval, which obviously will put some people off because some people aren't necessarily understandably prepared to like spend that long in the theatre. But there have been other productions of those. I'm just going to talk about those ones specifically, also because you've already mentioned Richard II, where they take the four plays in that history cycle from Richard II to Henry IV, parts one and two to Henry V, and they almost play them like the RSC did this in like the 2010s. They play them like in rep, where they'll have a similar cast playing like no, maybe not every, maybe not in all instances, but a cast that will like run throughout it. Or like the Hollow Crown TV series did that with Tom Hiddleston playing Prince Hal in Henry IV, and then playing King Henry in Henry V. So I think there's different ways to do it. You obviously also could do an amalgam version where you borrow bits from part two and smuggle them like and tack them on to the end of part one. I actually directed and acted in a production of Henry IV Part One a couple of years ago. I played Prince Hal. And we did just do part one, but I did think like after I saw Robert Icke do part two so well, I was like, oh, there's some really interesting things here that would add to the narrative of that play, especially with Falstaff being such a big part of part two. He's a big part of part one as well, but like you get to know him a lot better, I think, in part two. So yeah, I think there's real value in exploring the history plays and looking at how like you get a character because none of Shakespeare's tragedies do that. Maybe you go like Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. Maybe you get Mark Antony's story, but you really get to know um, Prince Hal become who he kind of is destined to be through three plays, and that's I don't know if that's necessarily the most appealing thing for everybody to go to the theatre and see, but like in our age of like Game of Thrones and like long box set
Yeah,
um binge watching TV, it feels actually like something that people probably do want.
they just probably don't know that that's what they want because people don't really.
Maybe not, but yeah, maybe that's not what they because people don't expect that to be what you get when you go to the theatre all the time.
Yeah, I think that's what like the Reduced Shakespeare Company opens the doors to is to
Mm.
see what all the plays are all about. So how did you end up being involved in writing a book on the Reduced Shakespeare Company? And let's talk about Hamlet as well, because they focus on Hamlet a lot. And Hamlet's a
Mm.
really interesting play, like really interesting psychologically.
Mm, well, I started my PhD at Warwick writing about something different actually. I was still writing about Shakespeare and American culture, but I was researching Shakespeare's influence on a American novelist called Cormac McCarthy, who wrote The Road and No Country for Old Men and Blood Meridian and it was interesting, but it wasn't really like it's not uncommon for people to change their thesis. And it just really wasn't really working for me as a topic. It wasn't really making me very happy. It wasn't really exciting me. And also because I love novels, but I'm definitely like a theatre person. And I much prefer studying and writing about theatre. So I then kind of reconceptualized what I was doing with my PhD supervisor, who I actually saw earlier today. Shout out Paul Prescott. And we together were like, well, there's this gap here, like this company they've never been written about. They'd been written about like in passing by a few scholars, but never like a full length study. I'd seen them when I was like 10 in Newbury, my hometown in Berkshire. They came to like a theatre called the Corn Exchange there, which they were actually touring to later this year, and I'm going to do a Q&A with them there, which feels like a nice full circle moment. I found the parody element of what they did with Shakespeare really interesting. Um, they were also like incredibly accessible. Three company founders and the two artistic directors. Um, all five of them were like really receptive to being interviewed. I interviewed all of them throughout the course of my PhD. One of them, Austin Titchener, who runs the Reduced Shakespeare Company podcast.
Really?
words. Yeah. So that was a task. Without sounding like prosaic, it just felt like the perfect thing for me to do a book about. In academia, sometimes it's seen as like not especially cool or like fashionable to write about something that like you are like a fan of as well. But like I'm a fan, if you could probably tell from when you saw the Q&A. Like I'm not, I mean, I'm obviously interested. I wrote a book about it. I'm clearly interested about it in an intellectual way, but I also just am a straight up fan, and I it needed to be written about. Someone needed it. They were a really important company. They had like the longest running. This was on the Criterion in London for like, it was the longest running comedy play on London's West End for years. It's not anymore, and they influenced loads of people. Like they influenced like the play that goes wrong, all that kind of stuff, that kind of slapstick, fast paced, abridged comic theatre. Like a lot of it is from them, so it felt like something that needed to be written about.
So, how do you feel about the second half of this reduced Shakespeare Company piece being Hamlet, and also the sort of parody nature of someone who is usually like people get very like they treat it like almost like a sacred text. People can get very upset about you editing Shakespeare.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think I love the second half of the play, and I think it's really clever and smart that they choose, despite what they've promised you being the complete works of Shakespeare abridged, where you wouldn't necessarily expect an entire half of this play to focus on one play. It gives you like a deep dive I guess in a slightly educational way into this play. And if they just like spent the equal amount of time on every single play, I don't think it would be as successful a
Yeah.
piece of theatre. I think for the reasons that you just said, like Hamlet's treated as this sacred text in a way, like lots of Shakespeare's plays are treated as sacred texts, but Hamlet is, I think, treated more as a sacred text than any. I mean, some people might take issue with this as a statement, but I think it historically has been treated as like the masterpiece of Shakespeare's life and career. And also like the fact that so many depictions of Shakespeare's life, like obviously most recently with Hamlet, so many depictions of his life revolve around the writing of Hamlet, and the idea that is it his masterpiece because he lost his son. I don't necessarily always buy all of that because I think he is, artists can just write about things because they're interested in them. It doesn't have, not everything has to be connected to like life experience. I also think that as a society, we are interested in getting to the bottom of why writers write about the things that they write about. Also, like Hamlet, it's kind of it's kind of about everything. like as a play. It's also like Shakespeare's longest tragedy, so it comes with that reputation of like, wow, okay, like there is so much going on here. There is so much text to get through. Hamlet speaks for so long about so many things, um, that it feels like the perfect play for them to do what they do with it. In like they're the ultimate reducers of Shakespeare. So why not dedicate your time to reducing the play that on the surface is like the hardest to reduce? It wouldn't make as much if like say the second half was dedicated to Macbeth. I
Yeah.
don't know if it would work because Macbeth is like Shakespeare's shortest tragedy. It's really fast and rapid pace and is kind of comparably quite, I don't know if it's easy to follow, but like the plot of Macbeth is quite simple,
Yeah.
whereas like the plot of Hamlet is quite complicated. It's also like so ambiguous. Like, is the ghost real? Can we trust like Hamlet's judgment? What's his relationship with various characters in the play is kind of up, like there's been debated about what do they mean, like his relationship, whether that's with Gertrude, his mum, or with Ophelia or with Claudius. I think the only kind of relationship that I would say is fairly straightforward in that play with Hamlet is Hamlet and Horatio. And even that's been like explored in terms of the level of like whether could you see Horatio as being someone who's in love with Hamlet. But I think what the Reduced Shakespeare Company are doing is, yeah, they're giving us the opportunity to kind of acknowledge that it is a masterpiece, but also that we, again, I know I said this earlier, when you were chatting to me, but that we can enjoy something, like we can enjoy a masterpiece without having to like revere it and treat it as sacred. Because I think as soon as you do that, that's a lot of what gets in the way for people with Shakespeare, is that because they feel like they have to respect it and that it's important, they actually might just not touch it because they think it's hard. And it is hard. I'm not saying that it isn't hard. The language is
Yeah.
hard. The language is a barrier for lots of people, and I understand why. What Austin Titchener often has described their work as like a gateway drug to encouraging people to go and see. Again, I'm quoting in quotation marks it real Shakespeare. So if like going to see this play, I see this as real Shakespeare, but I know what he means. If
Yeah.
this play, if you enjoy, if great, if you enjoyed this production of this play on the level of taking it just for what it is, then that's brilliant. But also, if it then encourages you to be like, well, actually, I'd quite like to go and see Hamlet itself, or like any of the, or Romeo and Juliet, or Titus Andronicus, or any of the plays that they explore in like
Yeah.
any level of depth here, then I think that's great. And the Reduced Shakespeare Company really, really want that.
Because it gives you an insight into each little play and also ways that it can be adapted, like Titus Andronicus as a cooking tutorial and all of that.
Yeah.
You can go see a wide variety of things, and I feel like that's something that it gives you an insight into. So, is there anything that you would like to promote to finish off?
Oh,
Really?
sure. Yes. Okay, I will. So this book, Shakespeare in the Theatre, Reduced Shakespeare Company by me, Dr. Ronan Hatfull, is so it's with Arden Shakespeare, which is an imprint of Bloomsbury. It's only in hardback at the moment, so it's expensive. And it's an academic book, and academic books are expensive. If you would like a copy, it's available on Amazon. It's available on like all kind of like good like book. I'm not saying Amazon's good. I just mean like you know what I mean. On all book all I get in trouble with Bezos if I say that. But it's available on all like retailers. Through like Bloomsbury's website itself. There will hopefully be a soft back release at some point, which would obviously be a little bit less expensive. It's also, you can also buy it in ebook. If you're a student or an academic, then like obviously please encourage your library to buy it and stock it, because then you can read it just through your library. Yeah, it's basically their history as a company, exclusively looking at their Shakespearean output, because they've reduced a lot of other topics as well, but looking at their history as a theatre company through their Shakespearean work from like their formation up to now. And I do an interview in as the last chapter of the book about with Austin Titchener, who is here, and Reed Martin, who is not pictured here, about their most recent play, which maybe is a subject for another episode, which is called The Comedy of Hamlet, a prequel. That's not been staged in the UK yet. That's only been staged in America. So yeah, that is my book.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Lottie.
So thank you so much again to Ronan for taking the time to film this and chat with me. I had a great time and I found it really interesting as well. And make sure to try and find a way to check out the book where you can, because I think it's so interesting to learn about all of these different adaptations and like a company that has so much history as well. And I will leave links to stuff to do with what has been mentioned in this in the description as well, so you can go check that out. And I will leave you with the bonus tip, and thank you so much to everyone for watching this.
So Lottie, one of my best pieces of advice in terms of if you're struggling to identify with or understand Shakespeare, but this is applicable to reading and understanding play scripts in general, is to like sit down and I'm not going to do it live, but like say I've got the Tempest here. Oh, it's zooming in. And I'm not going to do it, but like if I was struggling with a scene where you could obviously do this in like the privacy of your own home or your office, like I'm in at the moment. Um, don't do it on public transport because you might get some funny looks. But like reading out a scene, that's what was meant. They were. It's a cliche, but like it's true. Like these plays were written to be performed. Um, so if you are like sitting down to study a Shakespeare play and you're like, I have no idea what's going on, then like read them out, do voices, do different accents for like different characters, and I think that can really help and aid you to like feel like get that Shakespeare kind of in your mouth and kind of moving and living and breathing. And I think that can often definitely kind of aid your understanding of the play.